Interim Director at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I'd like to formally welcome you all to this very special lecture by Professor Philip Gorski. I'd also like to extend a very special welcome to our friends from C-SPAN who are with us today to record this lecture. Their presence here is important for a couple of reasons. One, I think it is a clear recognition of the importance of Professor Gorski's work. He has been acknowledged by and discussed quite prominently in the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Charlie Rose Show, among other media outlets that have featured his book. But C-SPAN's presence here is important for another reason that should matter to all of you, and namely this: if your cell phone goes off in the middle of this lecture with your favorite Star Wars ringtone or barking dog or whatever else it's going to be, it is going to be broadcast to all of C-SPAN's viewers and held and captured in perpetuity. So if I could invite you to please take a moment to silence your cell phones, that would be lovely. This is a very important year for religion anniversaries. One that you may all know about that's coming up is the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And on Thursday, October 19th at 4:30 p.m. in Katzen Concert Hall, we will be hosting a panel that is exploring the impact of this event. Now, on your seats, you should have found a small postcard promoting this event, this little pumpkin-colored card. It's not pumpkin-colored because Martin Luther was himself a bit shaped like a pumpkin, though he was actually. Rather, we tend to associate orange with Halloween, but that is All Hallows Eve. But it is also the case that October 31st is Reformation Day, for Protestants at least. It is the day that marks, in 1517, when Martin Luther famously nailed the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, setting off the Reformation. Now, this panel is going to feature three very erudite scholars, and then you're going to have yours truly as moderator. They will be discussing the Protestant Reformation's legacy and its impact on society, on politics, on religion, on everyday life, and the modern world today, really as we know it. Also on Thursday, November 9th at 1:30 p.m. in West Hall, 135, Professor Joseph Elder will give our Peace Studies lecture. The title of that is The Warfare State and Alternative Activities. Professor Elder is a sociologist and expert in Asian language and culture from the University of Wisconsin, so I think you'll want to join us for that. You can visit our website to RSVP and to learn about more details of our various events, and you can also, of course, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Today's lecture is part of the Maxine and Jonathan Marshall speaker series on religion and conflict. As dear friends of CSRC, the Marshalls endowed this speaker series because it reflected their long-standing concerns to promote peaceful solutions to pressing conflicts in our world. And their generosity funding the series continues to bear fruit long after their passing. But while that's the case, it's also important to remember that contributions of any and many kinds and sizes play a vital role supporting the work we do here in the center, and that includes student research and fellowships and travel and public programming and public education. So I'd like to thank all of our friends of the center who are here today, and this being an event on the topic of civil religion, I salute you as well. And for those of you who are just learning about the center's work, or maybe this is your first time attending one of our talks, if you enjoy our lecture and you value the work that we're trying to do, that is to understand the past, to make sense of the current moment, and to help collectively shape our shared future, I'd encourage you to become a friend of the center. There are envelopes kind of scattered around the room, maybe stuck to the bottom of your shoes. Feel free to grab one of those. As well, there's also a sign-up sheet in the back at the table at the entryway that you can get onto our mailing list. And finally, while I'm dispensing thank yous, I would be remiss if I did not thank the outstanding staff at the center who works feverishly behind the scenes to pull off a big event like this. Sarah Lords, our event coordinator, Carolyn Ford's our assistant director. Matt Correa is out there somewhere, I think, tending the front tables. Lori Perko, Pavan Rahil. Thank you all, team, for the great work that you do every day, but especially on big days like this. And I also have a special thanks for Jim and Ed, our team, our technical and sound team back there for their awesome help. Friends, we live in a very tumultuous time when ideas about what it means to be American, what America means to us, what it means to other people in the world, this is all very much up for grabs. We see debates about rival visions of America on the campaign trail and in daily political conversations. We see them on college campuses. We see these debates taking place in the workrooms and the break rooms at our places of vocation. They're happening in our dining room tables. And these debates are also unfolding in the streets, in protests. They're happening over and underneath public monuments in our public squares all across the country. And this past weekend, we saw that these debates about who we are unfolding even on the football fields and stadiums around our country. Football, of all things, right? There could not be a timelier moment for Philip Gorski's talk on civil religion today. This is a topic that goes to the heart of questions about America's founding, our history, our identity, our ideals, our sense of purpose in the world. Professor Gorski is going to give you a very full and detailed understanding of what that entails, but I'll just simplify it as this. I have called civil religion, at least in America, as the moral backbone of the body politic. Right? It's a collective effort to understand the American experiment of self-governance in light of some kind of shared heritage of stories, beliefs, events, symbols that we recognize as American. This is also a timely moment because this happens to mark the 50th anniversary of the article that coined this term, American civil religion, by the late sociologist Robert Bellah. And of course, he recognized that these roots of civil religion go way back, as you'll hear today. So it is not only the right time to talk about civil religion in America, we also have exactly the right person to do this, Philip Gorski. In addition to being a student of Robert Bellah at the University of California, where he did his graduate work, he is now a distinguished sociologist in his own right at Yale University, where he is also the co-director of the Center for Comparative Research and co-runs the Religion and Politics Colloquium. He is the author or editor of 6 books, and his research focuses on state formation, nationalism, revolution, economic development, and secularization, with particular attention to the interaction of religion and politics, interests near and dear to many of our hearts. His new book, American Covenant, was described by the New York Times as essential reading for the moment. I couldn't agree more. And I'd add, you can purchase a copy of this essential reading and have it autographed at the very end of this lecture, right outside. So would you please join me in welcoming this year's Marshall speaker, Philip Gorski. His talk today is entitled, In Search of Our Better Angels, A Story of American Civil Religion.
Well, thanks, John, for that very generous introduction. Thank you to the Marshall family and the CSRRC for inviting me here. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming to hear me talk today. The United States is in the midst of a deep crisis. I think we all feel it, some of us more acutely perhaps than others. The crisis has many causes. There's the growing economic inequality that has led some Americans to lose faith in the American dream. There is the heightened racial antagonism aroused by a black man occupying the White House. And there is the never-ending culture war between secular progressives and religious conservatives. It's the culture wars that are going to be the focus of my talk today. They've now been raging for the better part of 4 decades. Now, part of this conflict is about issues, particularly abortion and gay marriage. These are contentious issues, and I'm certainly not going to pretend to resolve them here. Instead, I'd like to focus on another source of the conflict, namely history. Right-wing culture warriors often argue that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Their left-wing opponents often respond that it was founded as a secular democracy. My thesis is that both of these stories are wrong, or at least one-sided, because our civic tradition has both sacred and secular sources. It is both civil and religious in origin, and that is one reason why I call it our civil religion. And while some religion can divide us, this one has more often united us, and I think it might help unite us again. Probably not all of us, but maybe enough of us to restart our civic conversation and begin moving the country forward again. Now let's take a closer look at that history. Let's start with the Puritans, with John Winthrop, the longtime governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Shortly before he set sail for the New World in 1630, he gave a brief speech. "We've entered into a covenant," he said, "and if we live up to its terms, we shall be as a city on a hill. But if we don't," he warned, "we'll soon be brought low." So Winthrop did not mean that America will be singled out for special blessings. He was not saying, "God bless America." Rather, he meant that we will be placed under special judgment. What will we be judged for? Our economic prosperity? Our military might? For winning? No. For our charity and self-abridgment, our meekness and unity. So there's the religious strand in Winthrop's vision. Here's the secular one. Elsewhere, he said, "No commonweal can be founded but by free consent." Commonweal is just an old word for republic or democracy. Now, the original charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony envisioned a for-profit commercial venture, not a Puritan experiment in self-government. By the terms of the original charter, only stockholders were to have political rights. Winthrop helped draw up a new constitution that extended political rights, not to everyone, of course, but at least to all white male church members, which was still a pretty radical thing to do in an aristocratic age of monarchical government. So from the very beginning, our civil religion has had a sacred strand drawn from biblical religion and a secular strand taken from political philosophy. Of course, the Puritans themselves fell well short of these ideals, not least in their dealings with the Native Americans. But the ideals themselves, justice and liberty, are noble ones nonetheless. Now let's turn to the second founding of the United States, the American Revolution. Once again, we find a complex mixture of sacred and secular sources blended together. Take the Declaration and the Constitution. The Declaration famously says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Constitution continues, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution." Familiar words, of course. Now, some interpreters have argued that our Constitution is godless, and strictly speaking, they're right, insofar as the Constitution itself contains no mention of God. But the same cannot be said of the Declaration. It speaks explicitly of a Creator, a God who made us all equal and endowed us with unalienable rights. Once again, a mixture of sacred and secular. But isn't this a mixture of oil and water? Aren't religion and republicanism at odds? So it may seem to some of us today. Not so to the founding generation. For them, biblical religion and democratic self-government fit together hand in glove. The touchstone text was 1 Samuel 8. Here's how they read it. When the Israelites requested a king, God gave them one, but only as a form of punishment. For what is a king but a false god, an idol? Self-governing republics are the form of government appropriate to a righteous people. They did not come up with this reading themselves. They borrowed it from medieval Judaism. Now, how widespread was this view, you ask? Well, it extended well beyond the ranks of Orthodox Christians. That much is for certain. Consider Benjamin Franklin. This is his proposal for the national seal of the United States. In case you haven't noticed, that would be the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. Or consider that runaway bestseller of the Revolutionary era, Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Now, Paine was certainly no Christian, but here's how he argued for republic. The prophet Samuel expressly disapproves of government by kings, Paine argued. For near 3,000 years, he continued, Israel was a kind of republic administered by a judge and the elders of the tribe. That is, until the Jews, under a national delusion, requested a king. So even the most skeptical of the founders regarded biblical religion and republican self-government as potentially complementary. Like the Puritans, of course, the founders fell far short of their own ideals. While the Declaration loudly declared that all men are created equal, the Constitution tacitly downgraded African slaves to 3/5 of a person. So long as men was taken to mean free white men, there was, of course, no contradiction. But as the abolitionist movement took hold, more and more Americans began to challenge this assumption. Some defenders of Southern slavery sought to do away with the contradiction by doing away with the Declaration itself. John C. Calhoun, the chief ideologue of the Southern slaveocracy, dismissed the claim that all men are created equal as a blatant falsehood inserted into the preamble to the Declaration without any necessity. He also wanted to strike a few phrases from the Constitution. Not the 3/5 clause, mind you, he was fine with that. No, what troubled Calhoun was the phrase, "we the people of the United States." He thought it should read, "we the peoples," plural, "of these United States." It was the people of each separate state that were sovereign, he said. He didn't believe in the United States as a sovereign nation at all. Now, many white Northerners agreed with Calhoun, including, to some degree, even the young Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln didn't much like slavery, but he didn't believe in full racial equality either, let's be honest, not at first anyway. Nor was he of the opinion that the federal government possessed the power to abolish slavery. So what changed Lincoln's mind? Well, in part, his own rereading of the founders' writings and the founding documents. After months of study in the Springfield Library, Lincoln concluded that the spirit of those documents was contained in their preambles, the preambles that I cited earlier, and that the spirit of those documents sometimes overrode the letters contained in their articles. For Lincoln, this meant that the Declaration's claim that all men are created equal overrode the 3/5 clause. It also meant that the constitutional quest for a more perfect union ultimately trumped the sovereignty of the individual states, including on the question of slavery. Lincoln was surely not the only one to reach this conclusion. The abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass was of the same mind. Indeed, Douglass may well have been the one who changed Lincoln's mind on this point. For Calhoun, then, the American covenant had one value, and one value only, freedom. But for Lincoln, it had at least two. Free government, yes, but also social equality. The United States had failed to live up to this creed. The Civil War was its just punishment. Or so he concluded in his second inaugural address. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away, he declaimed in March of 1865, "Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it still must be said that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." The Americans had broken their covenant, he argued, and the Civil War was their deserved punishment. For a brief time during Reconstruction, the United States tried to live up to this covenant and pursue racial equality in a serious way. But with the election of Andrew Johnson, they quickly reverted to their old backsliding ways. Let's turn now from the era of Reconstruction to the progressive era of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. A lot has changed. Industrialization has made the United States more powerful. Immigration has made it more diverse. World War I had turned it into a global power. It had also resulted in massive social inequality, in a nativist backlash against immigrants and Asian Americans, in an epidemic of lynchings, in imperialist misadventures overseas. The progressive era, in other words, was an awful lot like our own. And therein lies cause for hope as well as despair, because the progressive era was also an era of civic renewal, a period when some thinkers revitalized our civil religious tradition by reaching back to its deepest sources, philosophy and theology. Let's start with the man who came to be known as America's philosopher, John Dewey. Born in Vermont, raised a Protestant, Dewey became a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago and then at Columbia. In the process, he lost his religion, but not his faith, at least not his faith in American democracy. For Dewey, American democracy was a kind of spiritual project. Now, in many ways, Dewey's political views anticipated and shaped those of today's secular progressives. Like them, he believed that increased federal power would sometimes be necessary to safeguard democratic freedom. In an earlier America, he argued, an agricultural America, where property was more equally distributed, the power of the many had perhaps been sufficient to counterbalance the power of the few. But in the new America, an industrial America, property was so concentrated in the hands of the few that they could ride roughshod over the interests of the many. The only way that a balance between the few and the many could be restored, he argued, was if a democratic citizenry used the power of the state to counterbalance the power of the wealthy few. Democratizing freedom would involve tempering the capitalist economy with the powers of the national state. Now, Dewey's version of secular progressivism drew heavily on ancient philosophy, as this argument shows. In particular, it drew on the principle of constitutional balance set forth by Greek and Roman thinkers. To push American democracy forward, Dewey therefore reached back to ancient philosophy, to the very wellsprings of the democratic idea. Now, like the ancients, Dewey also believed that a democratic constitution was a necessary condition for a successful republic, but not a sufficient one. Like Plato or Aristotle, he thought that civic education was equally crucial. Indeed, for Dewey, one purpose of public education, indeed the chief purpose, was to form democratic citizens. Not by indoctrinating them with some whitewashed version of American history, no, rather by instilling habits of democratic association, habits of experimentation, of cooperation, of reflection. Nor was civic education alone enough in Dewey's view. It had to be combined with what he called a common faith. And here is perhaps the chief difference between him and some of his secular progressive followers today. Now, for the ancients, That faith had been a faith in the gods of the city. For most Americans, that had meant a faith in the God of the Bible. For many Americans, of course, it still does, but not for Dewey. Dewey's was a secular faith, a faith in democracy, not just as a form of government, but as a proposition about the cosmos itself. Dewey argued that democracy is inscribed in nature, that nature itself is pluralistic, relational, experimentational, open-ended, just as democracy is. For him, then, the democratic project really is a spiritual project and not just a political one. Dewey's common faith was, and perhaps still could be, a civil religion for secular progressives. Let's now turn from America's philosopher to America's theologian. That would be Reinhold Niebuhr. Born and raised in a small town in southern Illinois, Niebuhr was the son of a German emigre pastor. Following his graduation from Yale Divinity School, Niebuhr spent most of his career at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, just a few doors down from Dewey and Columbia. Now, what made Niebuhr so influential? What made him America's theologian? Why did he grace the cover of Time magazine not once but twice? Well, not what you might think. What made him so famous was the idea of original sin, or rather a particular understanding of original sin. In his view, the original sin was pride, not lust or greed, pride. Not just a sort of loud and boastful pride that is fed by a love of recognition and power, but also the quieter and subtler forms of pride that too often hide behind a veil of feigned humility or public charity. Now, Niebuhr worried a lot about the effects of pride in our individual lives, but he worried even more about the effects of collective pride in our political life. The most dangerous form of collective pride, said Niebuhr, are modern religious nationalism. What makes religious nationalism so dangerous, he said, is that it can join spiritual and national pride, and often race and class pride as well. Religious nationalisms, he argued, are not merely idolatrous, but positively demonic. Demonic in the sense that they involve the invasion and possession of the self by a racial and national spirit that makes pretensions to divinity. Alas, America has still not exorcised this demon. If anything, we are more powerfully possessed by it now than ever before. In part, I believe Niebuhr would argue, because we now tend to regard pride and self-love as sources of empowerment and self-esteem, and not as sources of danger and corruption, as earlier generations of Americans did. Now, Niebuhr's views about human nature made him rather skeptical about some versions of secular progressivism. For example, the view that education is the cure for all ills, for instance. Education is only a panacea, after all, if ignorance is the root of all evil. But what if the root of all evil is pride? Then humility and contrition will be more important than knowledge and erudition. Niebuhr was also skeptical about the progressive vision of, well, progress. Not because he denied the possibility of progress, but because in his view, history does not move in straight lines. Rather, it forms a widening spiral. A spiral, first, because progress is always followed by regress. A widening spiral, because as the possibilities of human cooperation expand, so too do the possibilities of human oppression. Globalization can lead to new forms of solidarity, but also to new forms of exploitation. Niebuhr was especially concerned about utopian versions of progressivism. versions which claim to know the end of history in advance and exactly how to get there. For Niebuhr, the end of history is not accessible to reason. We are not capable of discerning it. Indeed, for Niebuhr, the end of history is not even within history. It's outside of history. We can strive for it, but we cannot reach it. We can pursue justice, and we must, but we cannot achieve it, not in the here and now, and certainly not in any endurable way. Niebuhr urges us to be realistic, though, without becoming fatalistic, righteous without becoming self-righteous. How? By means, he said, of a guiding myth. By myth, he means a transcendent narrative that falsifies the facts of history as seen by science in order to state its truth. Our civil religious tradition, I would argue, is one such myth. Now, of course, no account of our civic tradition would be complete without a discussion of Martin Luther King. What Lincoln had been to generations past, King is to ours, our greatest civic saint. A man whose words are known to every American school child, whose speeches are a veritable civic catechism. King's stance toward the American project was a lot like Lincoln's and Niebuhr's, two of his heroes, highly critical, but ultimately affirming. Now, King was fully aware of the moral rot that had spread through American society as a result of racial prejudice. He had no illusions about this. But he never gave up his hope for political redemption. Indeed, in his various dream speeches, he urged his followers repeatedly to recover an older dream, the American dream that used to be, not the shallow dream of material ease, but the nobler dream of human equality and national unity that had animated earlier generations of Americans. The substance of the dream is expressed in these sublime words, said King: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Now, King did not regard this dream as his alone. Echoing the Puritans, he argued that God somehow called America to do a special job for mankind in the world. Never before in the history of the world have so many racial groups and so many national backgrounds assembled together in one nation. A statement even truer now than it was in King's day. And somehow, if we can't solve the problem in America, then the world can't solve the problem, because America is the world in miniature, and the world is America writ large. In this sense, King was an American exceptionalist. His exceptionalism, however, was not the Christianist and militarist exceptionalism of today. An American exceptionalism that sees the United States as an already chosen nation, the long arm of divine justice in a godless world. Rather, it was the American exceptionalism of the Puritan era, which saw America as an almost chosen nation, a people who had set themselves apart in a great collective experiment and been placed under historical judgment. Like Winthrop, King hoped that America could serve as an example to the world, and he warned of God's wrath should it fail. The judgment of God is upon us, he said, and we must either learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we are all going to perish as fools. Those words, too, truer now than ever. And then came the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. The civil religion started to unravel. There were still some veterans of the civil rights movement who kept it alive. There still are. But many on the left walked away from it. Some became technocrats, cheerleaders for globalization, preaching a gospel of economic growth. Others embraced a radical identity politics that highlighted our differences to the point of denying our commonalities. Only a few held fast. And when the secular left let the civil religion go, the religious right quickly seized hold of it and set about corrupting it. Jerry Falwell led the way. Jerry Falwell, well, for those too young to remember, he was the founder of the Moral Majority, the political arm of the new Christian right. Now, like Niebuhr, Falwell had lots to say about sin, but for him, sin was always individual, never collective. And it was mostly sexual, never social. And when Falwell denounced the sins of the people, it was always other people he had in mind. The fornicators and abortionists, the hedonists and the secularists, never the fallen members of his own flock. Of him who builds his house by unrighteousness, his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbor serve him for nothing and does not give him his wages, who says, I will build myself a great house with spacious upper rooms, as Jeremiah. Of this sinner, Falwell said nothing. And for the least of these, one suspects, Falwell cared nothing. In Falwell's hands, the American civil religion devolved into the very sort of reactionary religious nationalism that Niebuhr had so stringently warned us against. Now, Ronald Reagan also played a small but supporting role in this process, albeit a subtler and much more ambiguous one. There we go. For Reagan spoke of America not as a city on a hill, but as a shining city on a hill, a glittering object admired by all the world for its wealth, piety, and power. Reagan did speak of evil, but only with reference to communism. The American people were good, inherently good, and the United States were great, exceptionally great. So far from warning about the dangers of excessive national pride, Reagan subtly encouraged them. Gone too was the traditional worry about the corrupting potentials of excessive luxury and wealth. For Reagan, wealth was good, and unambiguously so. The only real source of corruption in American life, he thought, was the state, particularly the welfare state. And yet, to his credit, at the close of his presidency, Reagan did have this to say of his shining city. If there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get there. Reagan's civil religion might have been tarnished, but it was still racially inclusive. Too many of his contemporary admirers seem to have forgotten that. Now, eventually, the left did get its civil religion back. The turning point came in July of 2004 when a skinny guy with a funny name walked onto a stage in Boston. I stand here knowing that my story is part of the larger American story, he said, that I owe a debt to all of those who came before me, and that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. The greatness of our nation, he insisted, is not measured in the height of our skyscrapers or the power of our military or the size of our economy. Rather, it is based on a very simple premise summed up in a declaration made over 200 years ago. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. He called on the audience to hold these shared ideals up against a hard reality and to see how we are measuring up. And he did not hesitate to give concrete examples of how we had fallen short and were continuing to fall short. And he urged Americans to stand in solidarity with one another. For standing together, he said, is what allows us to pursue our individual dreams, yet still come together as a single American family, e pluribus unum, out of many one. 3.5 years later, in March of 2008, Barack Obama walked onto another stage, this time in Philadelphia. The infamous Jeremiah Wright videos had surfaced just a few weeks before. They showed Obama's former pastor delivering incendiary remarks about the United States. Obama had waited patiently for the storm to pass, but it had only intensified. He finally decided to face the issue head-on by giving a speech on race in America. There was much discussion of the speech's contents, but note the framing. It was a bit unusual for a speech on the history of race relations in the United States. It was delivered at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, rather than, say, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And the opening was not taken from, say, one of King's speeches, but from the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And the narrative itself was taken straight out of Exodus. There was talk of founding covenants, the Declaration and the Constitution, of original sins, African slavery, of a people's backsliding and marching, Jim Crow and civil rights, of a promised land that was always just over the horizon, King's beloved community. The civil religion had been torn to shreds by 3 decades of culture war, but somehow, Obama had pieced it back together again, and tattered as it was, it had not lost its power or its appeal. That much was clear from the rapturous crowds at Obama's rallies. Those campaign rallies often resembled religious revivals. They were religious revivals, civil religious revivals. Alas, the new version of the civil religion was not as strong as the old one. For the old one had originally been woven out of 2 threads. One was the Exodus story, the story of people who fled slavery for the promised land, who covenanted together around a common creed, who wandered in the desert and broke the covenant, who renewed the covenant and peered over the mountaintop. That was the thread Obama was pulling on. But there was a second thread, too, one that he held all too lightly in the other hand, also very old, civic republicanism. Republicanism, small r, is a political ideal that goes back to ancient Greece and Rome. It's the idea of a free and self-governing people, a people that eschews the flattery of would-be tyrants. In Lincoln's words, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Obama's version of the American story drew mainly on the biblical story of Exodus. The Republican thread was mostly missing from his tapestry, and that weakened it considerably. Now, what, if anything, can we still learn from this ancient tradition of civic republicanism? A lot, I think. In fact, many of its most powerful lessons have only been too strongly vindicated in recent months. The first lesson is that democratic institutions are very, very fragile, much more fragile than we Americans have tended to think. Asked what sort of constitution we have, Benjamin Franklin is supposed to have replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Whether we do and will remains an open question. The second lesson is that progress is not irreversible. Contemporary progressives sometimes imagine that history is like an escalator. You just step on and it always moves up in the same direction without much effort. For civic Republicans, history is more like a car jack. A small increment of progress requires an enormous amount of effort. And that upward progress can all come crashing down very quickly if someone hits the release lever. Indeed, I see a tiny little thumb on that lever right now. Third, civic Republicans know that democratic institutions are very easily corrupted. Today, we think of corruption narrowly as quid pro quo or pay to play, and there certainly is plenty of that, more of that. But civic Republicans also understand corruption more broadly as simply putting private interests ahead of the public good, whether those interests are personal, corporate, or partisan. And that, too, is pervasive. Finally, civic Republicans know that free institutions require civic virtue. Not virtue in the Victorian sense of prudery or politeness, but virtue in the ancient sense of bravery and self-sacrifice for the common good. For laws and institutions alone are never enough. People must be ready and willing to defend them when it's necessary. But too many of us have forgotten these ancient truths. And this is one reason, not the only one, that the American Republic is currently in such great peril, probably the greatest danger it has been in, at least since World War II. Though now, of course, the danger comes from within rather than from without. And that danger is only magnified by our current political polarization. Overcoming this polarization will not be easy. Those of us who are secular progressives might begin by recognizing the positive role, often positive role, that biblical religion has played in American history and indeed in the history of American progressivism itself. For secular progressivism is in many ways nothing else but a secularized version of religious progressivism. Conversely, those of us who are religious conservatives need to acknowledge the influence of secular philosophy on the American founding and indeed on American Christianity itself. The religious freedom that religious conservatives prize so dearly owes more than a little to the efforts of secular liberals to defend it. Having acknowledged that, we might shift our focus from the contentious issues about which we so often disagree to some of the core values about which we mostly do agree. Equality and freedom, for example. Both are enshrined in our founding documents. To these values, I would add solidarity and inclusion. Solidarity in the sense of care for the general welfare, as enunciated in the Constitution, and inclusion in the sense of our national motto, E pluribus unum. Those, to me, are indeed the 4 points of our civic creed as we currently understand it: freedom, equality, inclusion, and solidarity. I list them in what seems to me to be their order of priority: freedom, then equality, then inclusion, and solidarity. Now, I know that some would disagree. Some might put equality before freedom, for instance, or solidarity before inclusion. I would argue that the founders understood freedom mainly in political terms as Republican freedom and active citizenship, but you might disagree. Maybe you understand freedom mainly in economic terms, as market freedom or freedom of property. Or maybe you think that religious freedom is our first freedom. Now, these are arguments that are worth having. These are the arguments we should be having. Now, some people think that the source of our problems is that we argue too little. I actually think it's the opposite, that we argue too much. I actually think the problem is that we argue too little. Sure, we engage in a lot of ad hominem attacks. We trade insults, not arguments. The anonymity of social media has made the exchange of political insults into a video game of sorts, the most popular one this side of Tetris or Angry Birds. At other times, we claim that one of our civic values trumps all of the others. Conservative libertarians often insist that freedom of speech must have absolute priority over considerations of social inclusion. And liberal multiculturalists often counter the very opposite. Neither side wants to talk about how to balance freedom and inclusion, perhaps because it's hard. Moral absolutism is much easier. The civil religious tradition is not going to resolve these debates for us, but it does at least tell us what we should be arguing about. And it does give us some examples of how we have resolved such arguments in the past. What we should be arguing about is the meaning of freedom, equality, inclusion, and solidarity, and how to balance them in our national and civic life. Those are the philosophical stakes of the American experiment, that these core values can somehow be brought into a measure of harmony. Now, talk alone is not enough. We also need to repair civil society and rebuild civic solidarity. The first step in that direction might actually be for all of us to redirect some of our time, energy, and money away from national electoral politics. We might start by investing in a place, not a virtual web 2.0 place, but a sky and earth and brick and mortar kind of place. We might stop asking what a place can do for us and what we can do for a place. One way we might do that, and this is my second point, is by joining an organization. Not a point and click kind of organization, but a meet and greet kind of organization. An un- and demediated organization where people meet face to face and work together on common projects. While it's important to work within our communities, though, we also need to learn to work across them because our communities are highly segregated, more segregated than ever, not only by race, mind you, but now by religion, and party, and class, and age as well. We're all segregationists now, I'm afraid. Even the most cosmopolitan amongst us, who often have more friends and colleagues on the other side of the world than on the other side of the tracks. These are all things that we can do as individuals on our own personal initiative to rebuild civil society. What could we do together as a nation? Here are a few propositions. First, a renewed program of civic education. Many Americans know very little about American institutions and even less about American history. Why not give every American student the same civics test that every applicant for American citizenship has to pass? Why not make passing that test a condition for graduation from high school? Second, make civic holidays into holidays again, days when people do not work and cannot shop. Days when people might talk to their neighbors or watch a parade. Make Election Day such a day, as it is in many countries. Third, institute a system of national service. Require that all young people spend a year or two doing something for their country. Join the military, clear a trail, teach a class, whatever. No waivers, no exceptions. I could be wrong, but my guess is that most Americans would support these measures. But like a lot of things that ordinary Americans support, it's hard to imagine them becoming law. Why? In part because our political system is so thoroughly corrupted and polarized that nothing meaningful gets done. The source of that corruption is obvious. It's money, the endless flow of influence money. When 5 of the 10 richest counties in the United States of America are in the Washington, D.C. metro area, you know that something is seriously wrong. I know that we can't stop the flow of money into politics, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't slow it down. As for our polarization, the political parties are as much to blame as the culture warriors. Using big data and statistical analyses, the two parties have carved up the United States like a Thanksgiving turkey to their own advantage. As a result of this increasingly sophisticated gerrymandering, most congressional districts are now safe districts. This means that most incumbents are far more worried about primary challengers from the fringes of their own party, Roy Moore, than they are about electoral challengers from the other party. This would be easy to fix if everyone just followed Arizona's lead and put redistricting into the hands of an independent bipartisan commission. Candidates would then be forced to run towards the center instead of towards the fringes. Now, of course, not everyone will be interested in fixing the republic. Some, a small handful, are profiting handsomely from its demise and squirreling away the proceeds in faraway places. Others, a growing number, I'm afraid, are so determined to win the culture wars by any means necessary, democratic or not, that they have turned away, that they are more interested in blowing up the system than fixing it. Finally, still others are so disgusted, understandably, that they have turned away from politics altogether. Well, so who does that leave exactly? A lot of us, I think, actually. Enough to turn things around if we really were to pull together, as long as we're willing to listen to the better angels of our shared history. Those of us who are still committed to making ours a nation of nations and a people of peoples, that is the great experiment of American democracy. It's an intergenerational experiment whose outcome is still unknown, and it is still important, for the eyes of the world really are still upon us, and more than a few would like to see us fail. Not just because they hate our freedoms, though some really do, but also because they despise our diversity. They wager that it is not possible to make a democratic people out of many peoples, an inclusive nation out of many nations. I, for one, wager that they are wrong, and I hope you do too, so that America may be America again, a land that's never been, but a land that still must be. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gorski. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm sure there's going to be some questions for you. As Lori and Sarah are bringing up the microphones, just a reminder to please step forward, go ahead and queue up behind them. We'll alternate sides, so find the microphone closest to you. And remember, this is a question and answer period, not a discussion period. So I look forward to hearing your questions and to hearing Professor Gorski's response. So.
Right.
Sir, can we get to the, I'm not sure if everybody...
I can actually repeat the question. The question is about
Sure.
the question is about Roy Moore, who, as many of you probably know, recently won the GOP primary to fill Jeff Sennett's Senate seat from Alabama. And Roy Moore, as again many of you may know, is a former Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court of Alabama who had to vacate his seat due to various conflicts, including over his insistence on putting a large monument to the Ten Commandments in the State House. And he's been a guy who has courted and profited handsomely off of the resulting controversies. So, you know, I think this is one of those tricky issues. My view about this, I can tell you, is that I think that what the Constitution says is that there has to be an institutional separation between church and state, but it does not say that there has to be a sonic separation between religion and politics. So, you know, some extreme seculars say, you know, religious voices can't be heard in the public square, and I think that that's wrong and even counterproductive, because it forces people whose primary values are religious commitment to engage in a kind of hypocrisy, you know, which they then get called out for. But I think that the case of Roy Moore, I mean, I think this is very clear. This is, you know, somebody you know, who is in violation of various civic laws. This is somebody who is willfully you know, tried to breach the institutional separation as a means, I think, in part just of his own personal advancement. And it's very worrisome, but it is also a sign, I think, of the kind of disgust that I was speaking of that many people have about corrupt elite in Washington. I mean, it's hard to know how many people voted for him because they actually like him or agree with him, and how many of them just voted for him because they hate this Luther Strange guy as a kind of creature of the Republican establishment in Washington, D.C. Would that they had better choices.
What do you think in all of this religious history that has led to the fact that so many Christians, or at least American Christians, reject science and scientific reasoning?
Right. That's a very important question. I actually have one of my former graduate students spent a lot of time studying this, and I think that a lot of it really does go back to you know, the debates about evolution in the early 20th century, and the stance that some fundamentalist Christians took during that period, and the view that somehow to defend a certain version of biblical inerrancy, they had to reject the theory of evolution. But this has been increasingly expanded in recent years. So, of course, I think one would really be remiss not to mention the kind of well-funded campaign of public disinformation about climate change, which has been funded by you know, various people connected with, of course, you know, the energy industry. It's really sort of promoted this and expanded this, so that, you know, there was originally the suspicion about evolution. This argument has then been expanded to climate change. I mean, how much longer this is sustainable? And does another American city have to get knocked out, you know, before people start to see, you know, does Miami have to be underwater? Well, I mean, you know, just wait. I mean, it's all going to happen. So sooner or later.
Hi. This is actually a sports question.
A sports comment?
A sports comment question. Sports.
Sure.
My dad always taught me that sports, it's the last democratic bastion in the U.S. It doesn't matter what side of the track you come from. If you're good and you work hard, you play, you're rewarded. So my comment to you, or my Question to you is, what is your comment or thoughts on what's happening in the NFL today and what's going on?
Yeah, no,
That's a broad
yeah, sure,
question.
no, it's really it's a great question. I mean, like you, I'm really dismayed by the politicization that's happened. And I guess what I find, so I have to say that I'm broadly sympathetic with the guys who are kneeling. I think it's a fairly respectful gesture. It's not, a Black Power salute. It's not, they're not just sitting down. They're not going away. They're not doing anything disrespectful. They're, I think, just trying to call attention to, very serious problem. I worry a little bit about the way in which, although I understand, if you're, say you fought in a war, or one of your children has, that this, you find this disrespectful. What worries me about this is the way that some people talk about the character of the disrespect, that it's about disrespecting the sacrifices that people have made as opposed to the values that they sacrificed for. So, and if you see it in that way, then I think it becomes a little bit harder, the debate about this becomes more complicated, because in some ways, you could say those guys are kneeling in defense of racial equality, which is something that is that's promised in the Constitution, which is, in their view, my view too, has still not been achieved in this country. But it is, this relationship, it really is dismaying. I think you're right, that not just that sports has been, one of the most meritocratic parts of American society, but it also has been one that has sort of generated a certain kind of unity, right? It's still the case, like two guys meet in a bar, what do they talk about, right? It is a sort of a common denominator between people that kind of brings people together in a kind of friendly, amiable way and helps people kind of connect with and trust one another. And I'm really dismayed to see this, these rituals turned into a source of civic division amongst us. That's really unfortunate.
So many questions, so little time. What is your opinion of the Religious Freedom Act and the ability of the president to appoint one more Supreme Court justice that might make us a theocracy?
Well, so I am very worry about who will be appointed if there is another vacancy. To be honest, though, while I don't agree with, say, a lot of Neil Gorsuch's views, he does have a deep respect for law and for the rule of law. He's not, an amateur or a clown or, somebody who is just, a complete political animal. I worry that somebody like that could be the next appointment. I am, of course, still upset, at McConnell's tactics denying Obama the chance to appoint somebody who was very centrist, actually. Was very moderate, should have been acceptable to everybody, would have been acceptable, would have gotten 95 votes 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I do worry about that, but I don't know if the big danger at this point is us becoming a theocracy. I sometimes worry that it seems to me the clear and more present danger is actually in the rise of a kind of a secularized white ethno-nationalism. That, to me, at the moment, is the more threatening of the various movements that are out there. Yeah.
So civic religion, as you describe it, and as I understand it, is not necessarily tied to, say, a connection with a god or a specific theology, but the fact that it's a religion ties it to the same sort of effect of bringing people together, arousing emotions that are outside of just plain intellectual processes. And I'm just wondering, in our culture, a lot of the people who care about this kind of thing, for whatever reason, have a skepticism toward religion of any kind. And I'm wondering, what are some ideas maybe to, on the one hand, counter or work with that, and on the other hand, from the individual level, I guess, avoid becoming extreme in your own civic religion, I guess.
I think you're right to emphasize the difficulties that are there for secular and religious people to work together, though there are plenty of counterexamples. So, one kind of heartening example is that there are a lot of, for example, sort of young evangelicals, some of them wouldn't call themselves evangelicals anymore, but young Christians who, for whom this is one of their most important goals, is actually to work across some of these divides, and don't feel like they're really achieving their goals unless they do work with people who are, for example, from some kind of secular progressive NGO or civic organization. So I think that there are kind of people on the ground who are starting to do this, experiment with this, find out ways in which it can work. But I don't disagree with you that it will be difficult. Yeah.
So I like your suggestions about national service and also about civic engagement for high school students, taking a kind of a proficiency test.
Okay.
I'm wondering about what you think about how we could have people who are running for office to reveal. So like when Obama was president, I think we knew what was on his bedside table. We knew what he was reading. And he revealed his philosophical and theological basis. What's a practical solution or idea for how we might engage budding politicians and lifelong politicians to engage in the material and share with us where they're actually coming from and what's influencing them?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it would, like some kind of a test for office, for a higher office, right? You got to at least pass the high school civics test to be able to run for president. It's like a pretty low bar. I mean, not one that would have worried us, just a few years ago, obviously, where there was sort of enough of this out there in the kind of in the ether that just about everybody had breathed it in. You didn't have to be a reader, and you still knew this stuff. So, I mean, again, it is kind of an enormous failure, or a testament to kind of enormous failure in civic education. I would actually, I don't have any great ideas for this. I mean, one would be, I wish that there were also more college level courses like this. Some colleagues of mine are teaching right now, are co-teaching a course called The American Imagination, which is really just a kind of a survey course that introduces undergraduates to the kind of history of American political thought as a distinctive tradition. So different from your standard survey course on philosophy or political philosophy, but really just focuses on American political thought. I mean, I think that would be something like that would be a great service. I mean, also in the sense that, that's part of how knowledge kind of seeps out into the broader community. It's not by educating everybody, but by educating some folks who then educate others, right?
Hello, yes, I've been informed that I'm the last question. So I feel like a little bit of the odd one out here today. I'm a student here, and I feel like a lot of the messages that young people are getting from each other probably are that religion is counterintuitive to progress and to positive things, and I'm someone who believes strongly in both religion and democracy, and I wanted to know what your advice would be for young people who are going to, continue this country, how to best balance the two.
To balance religion and
progress,
yeah.
I guess, equality and democracy and all that together, because that can be difficult.
Yeah. Well, I just was rereading Tocqueville, who's one of my favorites, Democracy in America, and the whole book, it's about America, but it's always at the same time about France. And says, you know, what has allowed religion to prosper in the United States is that it has always been for equality and democracy, and that it has maintained a certain distance from politics without becoming completely apolitical. And that, I think, is pretty good advice. It's advice that's not being heeded right now, right? I mean, you have, not everybody, but a lot of people and, you know, the conservative Christians who've been in this death embrace with the Republican Party now for 35 or 40 years. And I think this is, in fact, one of the things that's driving a lot of people out of the churches, right? It's that, you know, it's like, I just don't agree with those politics. I mean, the people, you know, are leaving for political reasons, not really for religious reasons. They're rejecting the churches because of their political stances. And, you know, this is why these people don't say, I'm an atheist or I'm not interested in religion. What they say is, you know, I reject organized religion. So I think really, you know, that would be part of my advice. And I guess the other part of my advice would be, you know, that sort of one of the big tasks for younger engaged people of faith is to learn how to work again with people of no faith, to make that in and of itself a project, because that is really going to be, you know, one of the challenges as we become more culturally and religiously diverse in the coming decades. So I don't know. I hope that helps a little.
Well, if I could take a moment to first of all thank all of you for coming today and for the marvelous questions that you've put before us, and then ask you again to join me in thanking Professor Gorski for his time.